The Crisis of Exchange Value, the Productive Power of Science, Productive Labor, and Capitalist Reproduction by Kurz. 1. Preliminary remark: the left and the law of value. By now, 1986, there's truly no shortage of publications with a more or less left or Marxist or at least emancipatory claim about the crisis per se, about the crisis of work, of Marxism, the left, about the new technologies, the post-Fordist or even post-industrial society, and so on. It would be of little help to add another to the flood of these texts if the claim to opening up a fundamentally new or different aspect could not be made. Under this consciously self-chosen assumption, the present article must appear with an immodest, apodictic gesture. I therefore want to emphasize at the outset that this is by no means suggestive of referring to a particular height of one's own theoretical elaboration, but rather to the distance of left-wing journalism as a whole from any even somewhat tolerable level in the theoretical verification and reflection of one's own elementary categories. The helplessness of the left in the face of the new phenomena, including the political impotence, seems to be based not least on this fundamental theoretical displeasure. This thesis needs to be specified. Nothing less should be asserted than that today's left, in all its established fractions, has an understanding of the Marxist categories that is by no means authentic, but rather bound to a declining historical stage of capital. Ironically, the maturing objective crisis of the capital relation thus appears simultaneously as a crisis of Marxian theory itself, as it traditionally appears to leftists as to their opponents. While left-wing journalism is becoming increasingly untheoretical and in the grey cloak of receding modesty, turning more and more to the apparently innocuous investigation of partial questions of the surface, finally at least partially throwing the categories of Marxian theory overboard, and occasionally already in the guise of penance towards the positivists, explicitly relinquishing a theoretical synthesis of social totality in favor of sociological reduction. It blindly ignores the core problem of its weakness. Contrary to the general trend, becoming theoretical means conversely becoming fundamental. With regard to bourgeois society, however, means deriving one's own essential categories in a renewed historical passage from the critique of objectivity, i.e. from a concrete historical critique of the commodity fetish. But if it is correct, and that's what I'm getting at, that the traditional Marxist theory of epigones, including that of the New Left, manages to miss the issue already from the very first chapter of Capital on, then it must all the more fail to grasp the social economic reality, which is only now beginning to fully correspond to the fundamental categories of capital. As long as the law of value is understood only as the formal law of the social allocation of resources, which it is said to have a political effect on, but not as a historical substantive determination of essence, the transience of which asserts itself both violently and objectively, i.e. independently of all political expressions of will related to it, the understanding of value necessarily degenerates into a second category of nature and can no longer be understood as a fundamental contradiction. The definition of this contradiction at the highest level of abstraction, however, is that of the relationship between matter and form, Stoff und Form, and this must be conceptually unfolded in order to be able to understand the famous empiricism or surface reality. This contradiction between material and form of social reproduction, which is in irreconcilable capitalist opposition, can only be adequately deciphered as such as productive forces and relationship of production if the determination of the latter does not remain external to the commodity or valued relationship. The contradiction between material productivity on the one hand and the value or commodity character of production on the other would have to be worked out conceptually as the essence of the history of capital. This is the subject of the present text, and the task should be closer to deriving the absolute logical and historical limits of capital as a consequence of the most recent and qualitatively new stage of capitalist socialization and the development of productive power based on a categorical redefinition of capitalist value relationships. It should also not be concealed in advance that not only theory, which has become all too modest, but also the diligent and urgent practical politics of a left will appear as waste paper, which creates an illusion of social transcendence, if at all, on the ground and with the means that strive for value and money relations. But precisely because of this, it must shudderingly misunderstand the new socializing productive forces as a tremendous increase in the power of capital. 2. Use value and exchange value productive labor. In the current Marxist conceptions, the contradiction between use value and exchange value appears as a static, merely definitional one that is always only rigidly reproduced at all stages of capital development. The liberation of use value from the dictatorship of value abstraction, to the extent that it still appears intellectually at all, then remains an external, subjective undertaking that can no longer be based on the unfolding of an objective contradiction in a concrete historical process. But it is precisely the contradiction between use value and exchange value that is inherent in commodity production as such, that makes capital a processing contradiction, because under the capital relation it is transformed from an apparently static relationship into a real historical process that is urging its own dissolution. However, in order to be able to understand the process character of the relationship between use value and exchange value, it is necessary to rediscover this contradiction in the concept of productivity or productive labor. The astonishing and fairly universal crux of the Marxists is their inability to take this step. The contradiction between use value and exchange value remains rigid precisely because it is no longer held as a contradiction in the concept of productive labor. In this concept, the material use value and the value-determined exchange value side appear indistinguishably mixed up and are no longer resolved analytically. Right against the grain of a petrified historical interpretation, this analytical differentiation of the concept of productive labor proves to be essential in Marx. From this point of view, the concept of productive labor is fundamentally to be understood as twofold. Firstly, with regard to the use value, the material side of the labor process as a metabolic process between man and nature. Secondly, however, with regard to the exchange value, to the value creation process as a social metabolism of man with himself, in which work appears as dematerialized as abstract human work. Under the first analytical definition, the concept of productivity refers exclusively to the relationship between natural material activity and material useful effect, the relationship of which in turn depends on the form and quality of the tools and objects of work, which could be named the social level of the mastery of nature, and also the individual, again qualitatively determined furthermore by the dexterity of the worker in dealing with these socially prescribed means of production. In this respect, every work is a productive work, whose content enters into the material relationship between activity and useful effect. But nowhere in this determination is the purely material side of the labor process left in terms of use value. Under the second analytical determination, the concept of productivity refers exclusively to the abstract process of value formation, to the expenditure of abstract human labor as a fictitious substance of value, which appears on the surface, reified as exchange value. From this point of view, only that work is productive work that is presented directly as a social real abstraction or value-creating substance, as the expenditure of human work per se, as objectified in the respective product. At the level of simple commodity production, this analytical differentiation poses no problems. It could even appear meaningless, because here productive work as material and use value is always immediately identical with productive work as a social fictional substance of the value creation process, because the product only includes the work of the individual craftsman, producer himself, both in terms of material and value, in whose personal identity the logical separation of material work process and abstract process of value formation is abolished and cannot appear as such at all. Concrete, qualitative work and added value appear to be one and the same, and they are, because the abstract expenditure of nerve, muscle and brain, as human work in general, emerges from one and the same personal corporeality, just as the respective special concrete material work process of forging, shoemaking, tailoring, and so on. It could appear as if the analytical separation of concrete, qualitatively special work and abstract work in Marx was solely an ingenious intellectual achievement that finally formulated a logic that had actually existed for thousands of years, namely the logic of value or commodity production. In any case, such a view would correspond to the current Marxist understanding, in which the contradiction between use value and exchange value and the underlying contrast of concrete and abstract work appears only as a rigid definitional figure of thought, but not as a real category, as this contradiction then in the concept of productive work or productivity can no longer be pinned down. If this contradiction is maintained logically, then it turns out that Marx's intellectual achievement only becomes possible in the first place when material and value productivity began to fall apart. In real terms, with the capitalist mode of production, a process was initiated which, on an increasing historical scale, separates the material labor process and the value-added process and causes them to become increasingly disproportionate. The engine of this development is the capitalist-driven cooperation of work, a higher social division of labor that reaches beyond the narrow limits of the hitherto rigid and self-contained individual branches of production, and thus dissolves them just as much as it dissolves the direct identity of material and value-based productive work in the personal corporeality of the individual producer. 3. Productive total work. The transformation of the concrete material work process into a cooperative one, first in the form of manufacture, then on the basis of the machine system, initially only seems to reproduce the identity of the concrete work process and the process of creating value in a different form. This identity now distributed among a productive collective worker, to the totality of the persons active in the cooperative labor process, instead of being united in the individual producer as before. But on closer inspection, this identity quickly begins to crumble. First, and this aspect can only be dealt with briefly and cursory here, with the cooperation of labor under the command of money capital. Various functions that are unproductive both materially and in terms of value split off as special labor processes that go neither directly nor indirectly into the product, however are contained in the nature of production as the production of commodities, the commercial functions, buying and selling as such, and so on. These functions, which are unproductive in every respect, already exist for the individual artisanal producer, or they are performed by family members who also carry out domestic and subsistence work, but they are not split off as special activities and remain extremely marginal in the overall process of simple commodity production and are intertwined with cultural forms of social life which cannot be reduced to the dry categories of economic analysis, market day as a festival, and so on. With capitalist cooperation, these commercial functions are formalized, economized, and expanded at the same time. They are no longer limited to acts of purchase and sale, but evolve into marketing, market analysis, advertising, and so on. Secondly, however, shimmering functions are also beginning to appear in the immediate work process itself, which no longer have a clear identity with regard to their character as productive and unproductive work. The functions of management and control, the material work process as a cooperative one, is not just the sum of the individual parts, but includes the element of combining itself as a special necessary activity for the overall process, just as the activity of the conductor is part of the overall work of an orchestra. Marx uses this comparison several times. On the other hand, this function of directing in the capitalist form of cooperation is never a mere element of the material labor process, but is always simultaneously soiled with the character of the labor process as an exploitative process, i.e. combined with functions of control, oppression, and so on. The directing function is separated from the people involved in the immediate cooperative work process through exclusivity and externality, and therefore fundamentally rejected by them. Even more than the personifications of money capital itself, under whose command they toil, but which never confronts them as closely as those officers and non-commissioned officers, Marx, of the production process. These functions are no more rigid than the capitalist production process itself. They are transformed with every revolution in the material structure of the labor process. In part, the ruthless speed of the machine system takes over the task of the primitive surveillance, rendering all human control superfluous. But due to the nature of production as a process of exploitation, these functions can never become completely superfluous. They reproduce themselves even at the level of the most modern technological changes through microelectronics and so on, and only take on new forms. The ambiguous content of these functions corresponds to their ambiguous reference to the concept of productive labor insofar as they arise from the purely material character of the labor process as a cooperative one, conducting function. They are part of direct production labor and are productive both materially and in terms of value, but insofar as they merely emerge from the hostile opposition of capital and labor as bailiffs of the commanding money capital, they are, like the purely commercial functions, neither materially nor value productive. The split between productive and unproductive labor runs right through the people involved. However, neither the separation of commercial functions nor the independence of the cooperative management tasks from the immediate producers constitute the actual core problem of the capitalist divergence of substance and value. Rather, this essence only appears when we deal with a third category within the productive collective worker, which is usually not even perceived as such, but which only really manifests the contradiction between use value and exchange value between material and value-forming labor processes in capitalism. It is a question of those functions which, within the total worker, relate to the material work process, but not directly but indirectly. These functions do not arise from the commercial character of the mode of production, nor do they arise from the formal opposition between capital and labor, but they are also not part of the direct cooperative labor process that is directly materialized in a product. Rather, it is a question of activities alongside and above the immediate production process, which undoubtedly go into the material content of production, but not directly into a specific product. For example, technical in contrast to social control tasks, technical project planning, construction, and so on. Such technologically planning, controlling, constructing, and so on activities, i.e. brain work in the broadest sense, were originally all combined in the head of the direct individual producer, in that way as part of his personal corporeality and not separated from direct manual work. But the capitalist corporation of labor has the historical tendency to detach these functions from the immediate production process and to reassemble them alongside it. With regard to the value objectification of these works, the question now arises as to whether and how they, as separate functions that have been detached from the immediate production process, are nevertheless still subsumed as components of the productive total worker in the identity of the material work process and the abstract process of value formation. This is certainly true insofar as they still enter, albeit indirectly and mediatedly, into the objectification of a specific collective work into a specific product. To that extent, even with such functions, it would ultimately only be a matter, albeit in more complicated form, of the collective reproduction of the formerly individual production process in its closed identity of concrete labor and abstract processes of value formation. Certainly, the matter no longer appears quite so clear when such technological mental work that has been split off from the immediate production process no longer flows into a specific product, but into a wide range of products and possibly extends far beyond the respective individual company, corporation, or overall work. Undoubtedly, such work also enters the material work process indirectly and mediatedly. In this respect, they can be clearly identified as productive work in the material sense. With regard to the process of creating value, however, there is a gray area here if one and the same activity that enters indirectly into the material work process, say the construction of a control module, extends not only to completely different products, but also, e.g. through the granting of licenses, to products from completely different market participants. Then it becomes questionable how this, in the material sense, productive work can objectively still take on a form of value. Let us not forget that value, which must appear as exchange value, does not in its essence express a quasi-mystical substance inherent to things as such, as a fetish figure of exchange value suggests, but rather a social relationship of separate parts or private producers whose social division of labor can only be realized through the split-off sphere of circulation. However, the construction of a universally usable control module is directly social work, not only in terms of form, but also in terms of content and essence. In this respect, it goes beyond the mere transformation of the simple production process from an individual to a collective cooperative one. It is the expression of a higher form of technological material socialization that not only transforms the individual branches of production from individual into cooperative production processes, but also on an ever-growing scale begins to abolish these branches of production themselves as separate ones by blurring the boundaries between them technologically. Of course, specific operations for the production of specific products continue to exist, but these are now increasingly less the main content of the production process, but become a mere appendage and partial function of a highly socialized, networked total aggregate of immediate social labor. To the extent that a swelling immediate social aggregate of universal unspecific technology pushes itself between the actually specific manufacture of a certain end product and its ideal conception, various specific branches of production no longer appear in external relation to one another, but an integrated technological social overall aggregate forms arbitrarily combinable output systems for specific products as its subordinate subfunctions. With this, however, the previous social division of labor according to separate branches of production is materially abolished, and consequently commodity production itself becomes obsolete. As long as the technological material abolition of the separate branches of production had not progressed very far, i.e. perhaps still including the age of the machine system based on steam power, the idea might seem sensible to a certain extent to only replace the individual commodity producers with a collective cooperative one, i.e. to abolish the contradiction between capital and labor within the horizon of commodity production itself. In the old workers' movement, therefore, the concept of socialism inevitably remained very much in the commodity fetish, but thus also caught up in the money and wage fetish as the idea of a community of commodity producers in cooperatives and so on. If such ideas are revived today, then of course they are only reactionary, because these ideas had to perish together with the old workers' movement, above all, because the material technical socialization through capitalism had long since overtaken them. This only in parentheses. If the special activities split off from the old individual producer were initially to be determined either as productive or unproductive in both a material and value-related sense, or as an emulsion of productive and unproductive functions in the offices and non-commissioned offices of the production process, we are now dealing with a completely new category of total work, with functions that are productive work from a material point of view insofar as they enter indirectly into the material work process, which is becoming more and more technologically socialized. But at the same time, in a sense of value creation, and thus the capitalist valorization process, appear to be unproductive or at least plunge into a grey area, which, by its very nature, as directly social labor, falls outside the categories of exchange value socialization. It is in this zone of the reproductive process then that material and value productive labor begin to diverge and the earlier identity of concrete and abstract labor processes dissolves historically. As long as the functions of directly social labor, which objectively step out of the context of exchange value, remain marginal overall, i.e. appear quantitatively and qualitatively as vanishing compared to the mass of living labor that is used in the cooperative direct production process and that is still clearly materialized in a specific product, which can appear on the market as the product of a social partial producer, divided into commanding money capital and wage labor, the logical contradiction of value does not emerge in its true and pure form. This only happens to the extent that the capitalist development of the social productive power changes this relationship between direct, only indirectly social, and indirect, directly social labor in the material production process and finally flips over. On an ever-increasing step ladder, auf immer höhere Stufenleiter, living labor is taken out of the production process that is directly materialized in a specific product. The proportion of human labor next to this immediate production process and above it, which as directly social work only enters indirectly into it, increases on the same scale, meaning on the same ever-growing step ladder. The explosive nature of this development only becomes fully clear when we continue to pursue this historical divergence on the level of society as a whole, beyond the interface or gray area where work that is productive in terms of material and value begins to diverge. That is why I initially spoke cautiously of a gray area, because all definitions of the productive collective worker have so far only been developed out of capitalist cooperation at the factory or an individual company level, where they only become apparent at the fraying, decomposing edges of which as separate branches of production that are dissolving and merging into an overall aggregate. They are transformed into determinations of direct social labor. If we now examine the process of material socialization of the entire social reproduction apparatus, no longer quasi from below, from the point of view of the individual capitalist enterprise, but from above, from the point of view of the reproduction of society as a whole, then the concept of the productive collective worker must also be expanded to include this overall societal dimension. Then we are dealing with two interpenetrating levels of total work, that of the individual company and that of society as a whole, which present themselves as networked. On the second expanded level of total work, the divergence between material and value-based productivity becomes really clear, and the conceptual derivation only hinted at so far can only now be fully developed. In all pre-capitalist modes of production, the social context that extends beyond the individual production units, peasant or artisan families, is extremely poorly developed. Even the state exists only in a crude form, chiefly as the armed self-organization of the ruling classes. Capitalism not only transforms the individual or familial production units into cooperative large-scale producers who are integrated into a machine system on an advanced scale based on the division of labor, but it also sets institutionalized social framework conditions without which no such cooperative large-scale production for global markets are conceivable. Above all, this includes a deep social infrastructure, such as a far-reaching and branched transport and communication system, energy supply, controlled and institutionalized standardization and standardization of measurements, weights, formats, and so on, not least a comprehensive and structured scientific training system. All of these framework conditions of social infrastructure, which are becoming increasingly necessary, will soon have to be taken over and operated by the state or semi-state organizations, an indication of their essentially overall social character, of their fundamental reaching beyond any individual company reference. This infrastructure as a general framework is included in the total social production, like the natural basis and prerequisites of production. It becomes, so to speak, a material second nature, just as, on the other hand, value becomes an economic second nature. For example, the general average human capacity to work is no longer the originally natural one, but something that has been socially produced from the beginning, before any production activity, into which cultural techniques such as reading, writing, basic arithmetic, and so on are internalized. All of these framework conditions of social infrastructure cost labor and absorb a historically growing part of society's labor resources. With regard to the productivity of this work, what has already been indicated on the margins of individual company cooperation in activities such as construction and so on becomes palpable. They are productive only in a societal sense. As directly social or socialized work, they are no longer an expression of any kind of separation of social partial individual or private producers, but rather the exact opposite of it. By their very nature, these works enter into all moments of partial social production equally and indirectly from the outset. They are therefore always and exclusively related to the entire process of reproduction in society as a whole, and never to an individual production process. There's no doubt that these are social productive forces that are set in motion, and all the work involved is materially indirectly productive. But at the same time, by their very nature, these works stand outside the law of value. They cannot at all assume the form of objectified abstract work in the fetish form of value, because they enter all products equally and simultaneously as directly social, and thus cannot at all appear as moments of an exchange process of separate entities. With regard to the process of value creation, they must therefore always remain unproductive, because value is nothing but the essential core of the social exchange between separate partial producers, which necessarily becomes fetishized and coagulates into an apparent material substance. Here we have the prototype of the new work that capitalism first creates in many forms, but with which it abolishes the law of value and thus its own basis according to the real logic. The immediately social work, materially indirectly productive and essentially unproductive in terms of value. With the expansion of the machine system and large-scale production, however, this new directly social form of labor grows historically inexorably, both absolutely and relatively, in its importance for the social process of reproduction as a whole. With this, however, the law of value must logically become increasingly obsolete, and production based on value must historically approach an objective collapse. The related statements by Marx, especially in the Grundrisse, are to be taken literally and as a concrete prognosis of the objective historical development logic of capital, and in no way as the subjective program of communism, which in some distant future far beyond capitalism is only to be realized still. The Marxist left of the most diverse tendencies has indeed pored over the relevant passages in Marx hundreds and thousands of times and quoted them in the most contradictory contexts, but never conceptually developed their real logic as that of capital itself on the basis of its historical real development. Obviously not from a fundamental lack of an ability of abstraction, but from a historically conditioned bias in the exchange value categories that has not been overcome to this day. 4. Science as a productive force. However, the most essential definition of the content of the new directly social work is that of science. That capitalism as scientification of production is absolutely evident and therefore undisputed. However, in the Marxist theory, even this notion of the scientification of production is used in an all too rigid, unhistorical and abstract definitional sense, where the real historical scale of the process of the scientification is discussed. This is done without systematic logical reference to the value structure of production. Basically, two forms of the process of scientification can be distinguished, which penetrate each other and finally merge with each other in social production technology, which out of itself necessarily and completely objectively shatters the law of value and thus the production of commodities. First, it is the technological application of natural science that makes science an immediate productive force, Marx. Secondly, however, it is about work, organizational science, which only arises on the basis of the capitalist cooperative division of labor. Both forms of scientification should first be discussed separately and then in their mutual relationship. Natural science as such has existed for thousands of years. It arose in the ancient slave-owning society, but in accordance with the economic nature of the society, the natural sciences of the time, as part of philosophy, remained strictly separate from material productive activity. It was a luxury product of the ruling slave-owning class, a decisive advance in human history, but initially without any repercussions on production. The idea that natural science was a product of the inventive spirit of the direct producers and so on, as can sometimes be read in Marxist Critisis, on the other hand, arises from the naive prolet cult ideas of a vulgar materialism that always derives all social phenomena directly from the production. Historically mediated and reaching far back into the primeval society of hunters and gatherers, intellectual activity in general and the forms of its higher advancement are in fact initially a direct result of material production, but the further history progresses and the threshold of class society is reached as a result of the development of productive forces, the more material production and spiritual scientific activity, or even their preforms, separate from one another and become relatively independent of one another. The general correctness of the materialistic thesis related to the entire process of human development, that the forms of mental activity have their roots in material production activity, does not prevent the acknowledgement of the fact that concretely and historically, natural science as a moment in this process has developed specifically in separation from production. This natural science, as the socially abstract love of wisdom of luxuriant slave owners, therefore initially had nothing to do with the emergence of the social productive power of labor over long periods of time. It was an indirect result of the development of productive forces, but did not itself become the cause or motor of its further development. Insofar as the productive forces were further refined by improving the instruments and methods of production, this was in fact done by tinkering and brooding natures among the immediate producers, peasants, craftsmen, fishermen, and so on, but not in the scientific way, but purely empirically, accidentally, without concepts, not systematically abstracting, and in a series of logical steps that build on one another historically, therefore only extremely slowly and spread over very long periods of time, so that a change in production technology could hardly be detected over many generations, and new processes only gradually prevailed insofar as they were not tied to certain natural conditions at all, e.g. watermills. In antiquity, the emerging science with natural science as an integral part that had not yet been developed into its own discipline was already a moment of human emancipation from religion, at least from religion in its original naive, unreflected mythological form. But this approach to the intellectual emancipation arose at the same time and could only come about as the luxury product of an idle class of slave owners who despised material production, with whose historical downfall it did not completely disappear, but continued to subsist in the Middle Ages in the very rigid mechanical form of institutionalized religion, the Roman Papal Church. Since the Renaissance, however, the history of the new rise of science and its renewed transformation into an emancipatory ideology on a higher scale has been nothing other than the history of bourgeois emancipation from feudal fetters. The renewed, more far-reaching separation of science from religion, the separation of knowledge of nature from the belief in God, initially had a purely ideological, spiritual function for centuries. It was an ideal weapon with which the urban bourgeoisie began to forge against the feudal powers. Astronomy, cosmology, Galilei, Bruno, Kepler, as the basic science of a new secularized worldview were hardly suited to act as immediate productive forces. But the class that was to become the social-economic carrier of the modern emancipation of science from religion differed fundamentally in its economic position and therefore also in its way of thinking from the old slave owners who invented science. The bourgeoisie, in its historical rise and in its struggle with feudalism, conceived of itself as a productive class, Although this concept remained ideologically vague and fed exclusively on contrast with the obviously socially parasitic classes of the feudal nobility and clergy. The historical and ideological prerequisite for the productive application of the new sciences lay in this self-understanding of the bourgeoisie as a productive class. In order to let this actually come into being, a long way had to be covered first. When capitalism in the first half of the 19th century, i.e. at a relatively late point in the overall development of the bourgeoisie since the Renaissance, began to really develop on its own foundations by means of machinery based on steam power, this was historical. This leap in development of the productive forces is by no means the result of a systematic relationship between science and production. It was not scientists at first, but still empirical practitioners who started the decisive innovations, such as the technician manufacturer and the spinning machine inventor Arkwright, and they did not create these innovations on the basis of socialized science and technology organization, but individually. Of course, the development of natural sciences from the 16th century onwards was a general presupposition of the new technologies and above all of the enormous energy source of steam. But the technological commercial application did not follow directly from it. It remained essentially so throughout the 19th century, only very gradually did the systematic social organization of the scientific process get going. Its technological application and the necessary subtraction of qualification schools, special schools, expansion of the universities, foundation of technical colleges, amalgamation of science and big capital. Even in the Gründerzeit towards the end of the century, on the threshold to imperialism, it was individual inventor capitalists like Siemens, Daimler and so on, Edison in the US, who laid the decisive technological foundations for entire branches of industry. Industry itself was still developing, the majority of the working population had not yet been transformed into wage workers, the industrial processes themselves were still very crude and labor-intensive, the scientification of production was actually still in its infancy. It may be necessary to recall these facts in order to understand how extremely young the historical unfolding of the real logic of capital actually is, which Karl Marx had already anticipated ideally from the beginning through the power of abstraction, albeit on a distributed, enormous body of work that has remained torso and still awaits disclosure, that emancipates itself from the historical reductions of Marxism. The real scientification of production, which not only covers the entire range of production branches, but also reaches into the depth of the individual work processes, could only fully develop in our 20th century. And as always in previous history, here too war became the father of all things. It was the two imperialist world wars that not only brought significant new inventions and technological innovations, but also the decisive breakthrough in the state social organization of the scientific process and its direct connection with material production. And it is electronics as a direct child of militarized research, on the basis of which not only new industries were smashed out of the ground after World War II, but applied natural science was no longer just a technological basis and general prerequisite for industrial work processes, but the one overarching moment of the immediate work process itself. The scope of this change is felt by observers from all ideological camps when they speak unanimously of a new technological revolution. The second form of the scientification of production, work science, as the science of the organization of production processes, is much more recent than the production application of natural science and only emerged in the 20th century. It will forever be associated with the name Charles Taylor. It is true that the need for the planned organization of the production processes coincides with cooperation itself and therefore dates back to the very beginning of manufacture. But this organization remained immediate, natural, and above all external to the concrete work processes themselves, even throughout the 19th century. The industrial system initially not only made the worker an appendage of the machine, but other parts of the working class, in the beginning mainly women and children, while at the same time new qualified work activities arose on the basis of the machinery, which looked very similar to the old crafts, in part even emerged from it, but partly also have to be regarded as creations of the machine system itself, skilled workers. These skilled workers possessed irreplaceable knowledge of the immediate production process, skills and manual skills acquired through practice, which gave them a certain degree of freedom of action in relation to capital. But the unskilled workers also had a certain, albeit smaller, scope of action, in that they learned to exploit the gaps in the machine system, so to speak, in order to create tiny free spaces, breaks, and so on, to keep the average working speed as low as possible. The experiments of capital to get those various maneuvers under control, and from its point of view, this waste of valuable time is as old as the capitalist mode of production itself. They are personified in those officers and non-commissioned officers of the production process who, for the sake of cooperation, necessarily appear as special figures. But this control had to remain external, arbitrary and subjective, as long as it did not take on an objectified, operationalizable, in short, scientific form. Only the further developed stage of capitalist concentration at the beginning of the 20th century and the associated large-scale production of materials, which left behind even the most comprehensive forms of cooperation of the 19th century, not least in the highly organized and partly state-controlled war production of the First World War, created the general precondition for work science. Taylor himself, characteristically a climber from the qualified working class, he was originally a lathe operator, combined in his person a mixture of almost glowing ideological apologetics for capitalism with the innovative imagination of the brooding tinkerer and an accounting pedantry that enabled him to oversee the organization of putting the work process itself on a scientific basis. The elementary principle of work science consists in de-individualizing the control over the respective direct work process contained in the personality or corporeality of the worker, systematizing it and institutionalizing it as control outside of the individual worker. In this respect, what Taylor created can be described as the second level of cooperation. If on the first level of cooperation the individual total labor of a branch of production was split up into distinct subtasks, the command of which lies outside of the sub-worker, but with the representative of money capital, so now the partial work itself is in turn broken down into individual standardized work processes, the control of which also lies outside of the individual worker. In the industrial labor process, as Taylor found it, this new level of cooperation had to be directed against the worker. For the unskilled workers, the effect was devastating, for they were now deprived of their last little leeway. The assembly line, technologically by no means a specific innovation of applied science but simple mechanics, but organizationally a decisive step in the industrial production process, became a symbol of the new scientific work agony, presented unsurpassed in Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times. However, the assembly line, which was developed as a prototype in the avant-garde automotive industry, was by no means easily transferable to any industrial branch. The principles of the new work science had to fail all the more in the case of a large part of the skilled workers' activities, whose technical precision could not easily be broken down into standardized, externally controlled work processes. The age of Taylorism, or Fordism, named after the archetype of assembly line production, remained an epoch of permanent struggle between ergonomics and the working class, symbolized in the hated stopwatch of the reefer man who should optimally standardize the individual work processes in terms of content and timing, to the point of absurd consequences, e.g. standardization of the movement sequence when filing a document and so on. Let us now look at the scientification of production from the point of view of the merging of applied natural science and work science, a process that only began after the Second World War and is only now, as we see it, entering a decisive stage. At the beginning of the 20th century, technologically applied science and work science were still relatively separate disciplines. Only with the electronics and the resulting automatic control processes of production do they merge into a single unit. However, the characteristic of this development is precisely the minimization and tendential elimination of living human labor in the immediate production process. The gaps between scientific work organization and technology are closed precisely by the fact that living labor itself is taken out, no matter what place it previously occupied in direct production. However, this has far-reaching consequences. From the point of view of the money and wages fetish, Taylor was a capitalist monster because he wanted to shift the last remnants of autonomy in the industrial production process out of the workers' hands and centralize it. From the point of view of the money and wages fetish, the fusion of scientific technology and labor science must present a far more hideous capitalist monstrosity because it eliminates human labor in the immediate process of production altogether. But this is precisely what makes Taylor's genius clear with capitalist limitations. His work science created the preconditions for automation as soon as applied natural science was ready for it, and thus the starting point for the abolition of commodity production itself. Because the unification of applied technological natural science and work science implies the tendency to abolish the partial social work that is objectified in a specific product and the generalization of direct social work. The revolutionary working class attacking the wage system itself ought to raise a monument to Taylor, for he paved the way, albeit unconsciously, for feather-brained and even sordid, downright vile purposes of capitalists squeezing of living labor, for the final abolition of that directly productive labor, which precisely because of this direct productivity, which is materialized in a specific product, cannot be directly social labor and therefore remains bound to exchange value socialization. This tendency, whose objective maturity is only now being reached before our eyes, cannot be completed under capitalism since it's based on the valorization of value, and thus an exploitation of that immediate living productive labor which, according to its own historical logic, at the same time it tends to abolish. When Marx occasionally speaks of the abolition of work and yet describes work as the eternal natural condition of the human metabolic process with nature, then this apparent contradiction can now be easily explained. What is abolished is direct production work, and thus the old agony of work. What is not abolished and can never be entirely abolished is indirect, indirectly productive labor alongside, before, or above the immediate productive process, which to a large extent presents itself as increasingly immediately social and associated labor, and therefore objectively falls out of the framework of exchange value. A historical tendency which in capitalism can only appear as a fundamental and catastrophic crisis. The Marxist left failed to understand the logic of this ever-growing tendency in society because it limited its understanding of the capital relation to the rigid definitions that seem to explain all movements within capital, including technical progress. But it turns out that the rigidity of these definitions was merely the expression of an epoch in the historical development of capital itself, which is now coming to an end. In the merging of applied natural sciences and work science towards the tendency to automate direct production, the contradiction of capital as a relationship becoming a barrier in itself is only being taken to the extreme today. As a result, we are only now at the beginning of the new era that will probably last into the 21st century, and in which the core of the capitalist logic of development and crisis is only really emerging, in der sich erst wirklich der Kern der kapitalistischen Entwicklungs- und Krisenlogik herausschält. The elimination of living labor in the direct production process can today be recognized as such because of its advanced maturity, and it has become possible to draw more fundamental and far-reaching conclusions from this knowledge than the previous Marxist theory. Objectively, however, this tendency will not assert itself on a global scale as a one-off act, but as a longer historical period in which the accumulation of capital perishes and burns out. The technological process of merging work, science and natural science is still in its infancy, even if microelectronics has already provided the decisive prerequisites. The material production structures in a whole range of sectors are still blocking automation that is too quick and easy, even if, for example, in the automotive industry, which is best suited for this due to its assembly line structure, it is already tangible how industrial robots are starting to close those gaps in the machine system of direct production that were until now still filled in by humans. The imperialist industrial nations are still in global exchange with the labor-intensive producing countries of the Third World, from which they attract the abstract wealth of exchange value. That ghostly objectification of human work in itself, in the immediate production process. But there can be no doubt that the epoch has begun in which money must objectively perish, because the material productivity of the labor process itself is based on direct socialization and thus destroys exchange value. It is part of the irony of history that precisely at the beginning of this historical epoch, the Marxists and other leftists have strayed furthest from the concrete Marxian critique of value or the objectivity of value. That today, of all times, they are losing the last remnant of the memory of the objectivity of the capitalist contradiction and even sees the new technological revolution as an overwhelming increase in power and possibly the final consolidation of capital instead of the beginning of its objective demolition. An essential theoretical basis for this grotesque misunderstanding is the inability to capture the difference between material and value-based productivity, between direct production work and direct social work in the concept of productive work, if Marx's statement of science as a direct productive force is misunderstood in the sense that science itself is value-adding, a misunderstanding that can only be based on an intellectual bias and a value fetish, then of course every new stage of the scientification of production appears as a moment of perpetuation and consolidation of the process of value abstraction. In this way, while traditional Marxism had not even tackled the problem, the question of scientification was presented upside down for the new left. Michael Mauke, who was widely read at the beginning of the 1968 movement, asserted the shift from immediate to mediated activities causes technical and scientific work to directly produce added value for the capitalist or serve for the self-expansion of capital, i.e. enables the self-valorization of capital, thus serves the productive work in the capitalist sense. Habermas expresses this misunderstanding even more clearly when he writes, "With industrial research on a large scale, science, technology and utilization were combined into one system. Thus technology and science become the primary productive force, which means that the conditions for the application of Marx's labor theory of value no longer apply. It no longer makes sense to calculate the capital amounts for investments in research and development on the basis of the value of unskilled simple labor, when scientific and technological progress has become an independent source of surplus value, against which the sole source of surplus value considered by Marx, the labor power of the immediate producers, is becoming less and less important." It is written all over the face of such statements that their value has become a fetish concept, but it was precisely on this point that the left did not engage in any fundamental dispute with Habermas. The state of affairs only proves that the new left, as a whole, shares the fetishization of value with Habermas and has never progressed beyond this in its theory formation and political objectives, i.e. that its criticism of the traditional labor movement has not touched that decisive question at all. This becomes clear at the latest when one sees that the only criticism of the productive power of science theorem came from a few K-groups whose terminology had completely reverted to the petrified prolet cult of the Third International, For the few relevant statements from this corner, the problem is no less wrong than with Mauke and Habermas, just viewed the other way around. Their adherence to the fact that the productive force of science does not create value, which is of course not derived theoretically at all, but merely remains as a dogmatic assertion of faith, then appears as immediately identical with the statement that science consequently cannot be a direct productive force, even in material terms, but at most a matter external to the production process. Both in this and in the seemingly opposite view of Mauke, Habermas and others are holding on to the historical identity of material and value-based productivity without concept and without any analytical differentiation, which capitalism actually abolishes, and thus leads itself ad absurdum in its secular movement. Only the consequences are just as opposite as the evaluation. For Habermas, at least, the entire intellectual circle of the Frankfurt School or the left-wing academic socialists, the result that emerged partly earlier and partly later, that the revolutionary subject of the working class had become obsolete instead of exchange value becoming obsolete, but with it came also a shallow reformism on the basis of the supposedly productive power of science, perpetuated through the exploitation of value. Conversely, in the K-groups, the Stalinist proletarian cult emerged again in burlesque intellectual disguise, clinging to the naive pride of work of the direct producer who boasts that he creates all values, instead of tangibly abolishing value altogether. 5. Relative surplus value and the developmental logic of capital. It would now be necessary to show how the divergence between material and value-related productivity appears successively in the social reproduction process of capital and constitutes the historical developmental logic of the capitalist mode of production. As it is well known, the key concept for understanding this logic is that of relative surplus value. This concept of relative surplus value is an analytical category of Marx, and at the same time a real category of the reproduction of capital in society as a whole, but not a superficial category that would also appear in the consciousness of the representatives of money capital. Given an absolute physical limit both in length of hours worked and in intensity of work, and a relative social limit of the working day, restrictions imposed by the labor movement or by state intervention, the valorization of value transforms from an extensive and absolute one into a relative and intense movement. The basis of valorization is and remains surplus value as such, i.e. the fact that the capitalists yield apparently the value-based output of the entire aggregate of dead and living labor is nothing other than that part of the new value which living labor created beyond their own reproductive costs. However, if the capitalist share of this new value can no longer be increased extensively through the absolute lengthening of the working day, its growth becomes dependent on the intensive and relative increase in surplus labor, mediated by the development of productive power, i.e. progressive scientification of the production process. What appears in the case of individual capital as the difference between the individual value and the social level of value appears when the new productive power is generalized in society as a whole as a reduction in the reproduction costs of the commodity labor power. The production of relative surplus value thus necessarily becomes the main means of capitalists' accumulation. With this, however, three logical historical consequences are set in the overall movement of capital mediated by competition, the third of which is hardly dealt with not only in bourgeois but also in Marxist theory. The first consequence is that the increased capitalist share of the new value created causes an escalation in the output of material products, which in turn forces the expansion of markets and the acceleration of accumulation. Capital hunts across the globe. This law of movement, as it drives individual capital, is multiplied and politicized on a higher level of state organizational forms, of national total capitalist blocks. The competition for the higher productive power and for the markets takes place on all levels, on the level of individual capitals, as well as on the level of capitalist states and alliance blocs. This process concentrates and centralizes capital within individual states. At the same time, the world market as an economic theater of war for the struggle for markets for goods and capital, for sources of raw materials, spheres of influence and so on, is transformed into a global political arena. The capitalist world economy gives birth to world politics. Political military power becomes the condition of economic competitiveness and strikes back on the economic basis. The hot war, the naked violence, tendential and in this century twice real, the world war with millions of victims becomes the ultima ratio of competition. Quite obviously, in this capitalist world system known as imperialism, the war is by no means the direct result of the economic crisis, neither the crisis of overproduction nor any other, but is grounded in the logic of world market competition of the capitals, the Kapitalien, and the inherent dynamics of world politics itself. The most important revolutions of this century did not result from economic crisis and therefore also not from a burning out of the capitalist logic as such, but from political crisis in connection with military conflicts and defeats of the ruling classes, starting with the Paris Commune of 1870, then the October Revolution, the German November Revolution, the Chinese Revolution after the Second World War, the specifics of the anti-colonial revolutions, for example Algeria and Southeast Asia, would have to be dealt with separately. Even if the capitalist world economy flips into the phenomenon of world politics, which gains its own momentum and produces its own laws, the underlying economic accumulation movement of relative surplus value remains decisive in the last instance. Imperialist violence, the logical endpoint of military intervention, does not in the least eliminate the economic starting point of competition, nor can it solve the conflicts that arise from it. The competition must be reproduced at all levels, albeit in ever new forms. The struggle for the development of productive power and for markets is never determined or finally decided by mere violence, as the brilliant economic rise of the FRG and Japan in the prosperity phase after the Second World War shows, despite military defeat and long-lasting political military weakness. The compulsion to develop productive power is contained in the dynamic logic of the political military competition, as shown by the Sputnik shock of 1957 and the subsequent technological thrust in the West, as well as in the purely economic competition that continues to have an effect as it is today in the Federal Republic of Germany and Western Europe, signaling the technological race with Japan and the USA for the top positions in microelectronics, genetic engineering and so on. The second consequence of accumulation through the increase in relative surplus value is the progressive depreciation of each individual product, i.e. the products cheap down in this incessant process of competition-mediated development of the productive forces. This tendency to make products cheaper means that more and more luxury items from the past are included in mass consumption. It creates and develops new higher needs, which Marx rightly counts as part of the civilizing mission of capital. Contrary to some theoretical claims, this tendency also essentially continues in imperialism, monopoly capitalism or late capitalism, i.e. even monopoly or state monopoly cannot ultimately override the law of value in principle. Even in the 20th century, a whole series of earlier luxury products entered mass consumption through the development of productive power and the resulting cheaper price, e.g. motor vehicles, electric household appliances and so on in the middle of this century, calculators etc. only very recently. The fact that the motor vehicle became accessible to the masses in the form of the automobile and chaotic private transport with all the devastating consequences for the public, i.e. communal means of transport, were by no means developed in the same way. But nonetheless, there is in principle a civilizational element in the generalization of the motor vehicle. It creates a new mobility, a new mass need for travel, thus contributing to the sudden expansion of the horizon and the creation of an internationalized society and so on. even if this process at the same time creates partly grotesque frictions. If the criticism is not directed against the capitalist formal determination of the generalization of the motor vehicle, but against it itself, then the conservative, culturally pessimistic point of view, the Herrenreiter, shimmers through behind it, who only mourns the privileges of the chosen ones. The third consequence, however, and this is largely buried in theory, is that capital becomes the absolute logical and historical limit to itself in the production of relative surplus value. Capital does not and cannot interest the absolute creation of value. It is solely and exclusively fixated on the surplus value in its superficially appearing forms, i.e., on the relative relationship within the created new value between the value of labor power, its reproduction costs, and a capitalist value appropriated part of the new value. As soon as capital can no longer absolutely expand the creation of value by lengthening the working day, but is only able to increase its relative share within the created new value through the development of productive power, an opposite movement takes place in the production of relative surplus value, which historically consumes itself and has to work towards and reach the total standstill of value creation itself. With the development of productive power, capital increases the degree of exploitation, but in doing so undermines the basis and object of exploitation, the production of value as such. Because the production of relative surplus value as a scientification of the material production process includes the tendency to eliminate living direct production work as the only source of value creation for society as a whole. The same movement that increases the relative share of capital in the new value reduces the absolute base of value production by eliminating direct living production labor. Capital creates, as necessary as it is unconsciously, directly social labor that has stepped out of the value relation and whose material productive power reduces the total social working time, but only for the sole purpose of increasing the rate of exploitation of the direct producers. It develops the social productive power for non-social purposes and interests and thus becomes entangled in a contradiction that cannot be resolved on its own basis, the final logic of which Marx outlines as follows. A development of the productive forces which reduced the absolute number of workers, i.e. actually enabled the whole nation to carry out its total production in a lesser part of the time, will bring about revolution, because it would throw the majority of the population off its course. Here again the specific limit of capitalist production appears, and that it is by no means an absolute form for the development of the productive forces and the creation of wealth, but rather comes into collision with them at a certain point. Partially, this collision appears in periodic crises, which result from the making redundant now this, now that part of the working population in their old ways of employment. The limit is the surplus time of the workers. The absolute excess time that society gains is none of its business. The development of productive power is important to it only insofar as it increases the surplus labor time of the working class and does not reduce the labor time for material production in general, and it thus moves in the opposite direction. From the capitalist development logic of accumulation through relative surplus value production outlined here, three questions inevitably arise. First, why has capitalism survived to this day despite its absolute immanent limit? Secondly, why is capital, including its theoretical representatives, blind to its own limit, to the tendency to reduce the absolute value creation of society as a whole? Third, why did Marxist theory itself drop this topic and not further concretize and sharpen it beyond Marx? These questions will now be answered briefly. 6. The historical expansion of capital. The production of relative surplus value refers to the relationship between the capitalist share of the new value and the reproduction cost of labor power for each individual worker, but not for the absolute quantity of wage laborers employed, and thus also not to the absolute mass of surplus value, which, along with the reduction of absolute added value, is necessarily also reduced. As a result, the situation arises where the same reasons which make it possible to increase the degree of exploitation of labor prohibit exploiting just as much labor as before with the same total capital. These are the conflicting tendencies which, while tending to an increase in the rate of surplus value, at the same time drive the fall in the mass of surplus value produced by a given capital and hence the rate of profit. From this arises the compelling necessity for capital to grow as capital, i.e. the reduction in the absolute mass of surplus value through an increase in the relative rate of surplus value, must be compensated for by the fact that the capital reproduces itself not on a constant but on an expanded scale, as a result of which inevitably the need for limitless accumulation growth arises. The development is constantly being potentiated, while capital eliminates living direct productive labor related to a given level of production. It must simultaneously absorb more new living direct productive labor related to an extended level of production. For this, however, capital needs a social space, a terrain it has not yet grasped, into which it can grow historically. If this process of expansion encounters obstacles, if capital cannot, even temporarily, absorb more new living productive labor than it has eliminated through technological development, then this rendering superfluous, now this, now that part of the working population and their old ways of employment also leads to periodic crisis. Because in this case, the material technologically mediated increase in the rate of surplus value actually leads to the fall of the mass of surplus value produced and therefore to the rate of profit, i.e. the production is no longer capitalistically worthwhile and tends to come to a standstill as long as it is in capitalist hands. The tendency of the fall in the rate of profit should therefore only be understood as defining the form of the crisis, the ultimate content of which is based on the material development of productive power and its absolute contrast to the value structure of production in general. The crisis is only partial, periodic, and therefore temporary if capital succeeds in overcoming the obstacle to its expansion and again absorbing more living productive labor than it previously eliminated. Then the fall in the rate of profit is reversed and brought to a standstill. The tendency character of this case is not to be understood as a continuous process, but as a historical discontinuity. This case is fundamentally inherent to the development of the productive power of the material labor process, but can always be reversed as long as capital is again in a position to begin a new cycle of accumulation by again expanding the absolute mass of applied living production labor. But the concept of this extended reproduction, accumulation or expansion of capital remains hollow and unclear if this process of expansion is only considered in its value form and is related to the pure value form of production but not systematically to the material content of this expansion. Then, and only then, can this process of accumulation no longer be understood as finitely conclusive, for the abstract wealth as money is by its very nature limitless and incessant, while the material content is historically absolutely limited. But there is no accumulation without a material vehicle, no matter how much that would be the ideal of capital. The expanded absorption of living direct production work must relate to such a material content and carrier, and this can also be traced historically in many concrete ways. On the other hand, in the course of capitalist development, the elimination of human labor in the immediate production process was always surpassed anew by the opposing absorption of living labor in new branches of production for new needs. Here too, different phases can be distinguished in the scale of capitalist development. Here too, the Second World War and the decades that followed brought about a new surge in capital accumulation. Only with the help of the scientific and technological innovations of the World War did certain products, which were previously manufactured more or less as luxury goods for a narrow class, enter mass production and mass consumption. Automobiles, electric household appliances, then consumer electronics and so on. All of these products experienced their technological maturity in the face of their real mass production only in the 50s and 60s. A stage of scientification becomes visible here, in which the development of productive forces on the one hand eliminates living labor in numerous branches of production and thus makes sometimes this, now that part of the working population superfluous in their old ways of employment, but only in order to create new branches of production, or until now to make underdeveloped ripe for cheapening and mass production. As a result, large masses of living labor are once again sucked into capitalist production, and the working population that has been made superfluous is again incorporated into an extended scale of value and surplus value production. Today, however, both essential forms or moments of the capitalist expansion process are beginning to come up against absolute material limits. Capitalization reached its saturation point in the 1960s. The source of absorption of living labor has finally come to a standstill. At the same time, the merging of scientific technology and work science and microelectronics implies a fundamentally new stage in the revolution of the material work process. The microelectronic revolution not only eliminates living work in direct production in this or that specific production technology, but for the first time on a broad front and across all branches of production, even including the unproductive areas. This process has only just begun and will only really take hold in the second half of the 1980s. Presumably it will last until the end of the century and beyond. To the extent that new branches of production are created in this process, for example in the production of microelectronics itself or in genetic engineering, they are inherently less labor-intensive in direct production from the outset. With this, the previous historical compensation for the absolute immanent limit of the capitalist mode of production, which is based on relative surplus value, collapses. The massive elimination of living production work as a source of value creation can no longer be compensated for by cheaper products entering mass production, because this mass production is no longer mediated by sucking back into production workers who were previously superfluous elsewhere. The relationship between the elimination of living production work through scientification on the one hand and the absorption of living production work through capitalization processes or the creation of new branches of production on the other hand is historically and irrevocably overturned. From now on, more work is inexorably eliminated than can be absorbed. All of the technological innovations that are still to be expected will only go in the direction of the further elimination of living labor. All of the new branches of production that are still to be expected will come into being from the outset with less and less direct human production work. The objective stepping out of social production from the limits of fictitious objects of value must sooner or later also make itself felt on the surface with full force. That a commodity as a material product as we see it in front of us is an object of value. This idea has become so ingrained in the flesh and blood of the abstract individuals of commodity production as a fetish concept that even the Marxists occasionally forget what the value actually is. Namely, the socially real fiction of objectified human labor in the immediate production process. One only needs, like Habermas and others, to omit the attribute immediate and to even ascribe to the directly social work flowing into entire palettes of products a mystical added value, only indirectly and indistinctly, in order to arrive at this fetishistic result, while completely ignoring the seriousness of the problem. The fact that the content of value disappears socially does not mean, of course, that the resulting forms of social intercourse also leave nothing but applause, since the interests of the exploiters are inextricably linked to it. Capital, which has as its essence the miserable basis of wealth, Marx, as the exploitation of living labor and at the same time dissolves this basis through its own movement, will and must try with all its might to maintain value as value, i.e. to let continue a form that is becoming empty and robbed of its social content as a general mode of intercourse. This must result in catastrophic social collisions. This new and final crisis of capitalism differs fundamentally from all previous crises. All previous crises were a growth crisis of capital, which could only temporarily interrupt the accumulation process, but the new crisis turns out to be the end of the process of accumulation of abstract wealth itself, because concrete material wealth can no longer be produced within the limits of the value relationship. The new crisis is therefore no longer a temporary crisis of overaccumulation or overproduction, but rather a crisis of value creation itself, from which capital can no longer find a way out. It can already be seen today that the crisis, which in the 1970s finally replaced the phase of accumulation and general prosperity after the Second World War, essentially promises to be such a final crisis of capital and differs in its basic features from all previous processes already on the surface in two different aspects. For the first time, the crisis began to become visible not only as a market crisis of capital and goods, but as a crisis of money itself. Inflation, almost unknown as a term before World War I, erupting as a result of the state-capitalist war economy after the world wars, especially in Germany, has meanwhile become a permanent phenomenon in the imperialist countries as well as in the Third World. It is a fact that not only the products are devalued in the competitive struggle, but also money itself in society as a whole and worldwide. This astonishing process has a very simple reason, namely the fact that the material wealth with the enormous development of technological productive power is no longer expressible in the real money commodity gold. The gold standard was still universal up until World War I, i.e. the banknotes of all major industrialized countries were directly convertible into gold. Since then, the material productivity has exceeded the money commodity as gold to an ever-increasing extent. The last umbilical cord to the gold standard was severed in the early 1970s with the abandonment of the Bretton Woods system, i.e. the dollar as world money was finally decoupled from the gold standard. But this means nothing other than the gradual abolition of money as a commodity, because the paper money issued in masses without gold backing no longer contains any real substance of value apart from the negligible amount of labor for the production of paper money. This is now generally true for paper money, as well as for purely accounting-related bank money, especially for such a fantastic and purely legal creation out of nothing as the artificial world money, special drawing rights SDR of the International Monetary Fund, which can only circulate between central banks. However, the disappearance of the value substance of money reflects the tendency towards the disappearance of value in general, the stepping out of material production from the limits of value. This does not mean at all that the old view of the vulgar economists, castigated by Marx, of the purely technical function of money has become a reality, but rather that the mode of production and circulation based on money is increasingly losing its reality content, that the socially real fiction of value becomes unreal and its fictional character also appears as such on the surface. The value is transformed into an empty shell that is no longer up to the material content. Of course, capital and the capitalist politicians, experts, try under all circumstances to maintain value as value and the abstraction of money as a real abstraction, no matter what the cost. The currency and the other monetary manipulations are becoming more and more tricky, more complicated, less credible. In the historical few years since the abandonment of the Bretton Woods system, the international monetary and credit system has come close to collapse several times, and the collapse manifested as a global bank crash, a collapse of the international credit system, and a wave of currency reforms with the actual expropriation of large masses of the people cannot be postponed forever. The new dimension of a historical final crisis of capital must ultimately assert itself from the monetary side as an insoluble money crisis with full force, albeit through many attempts by currency and credit technicians to slow it down. The second fundamentally new phenomenon, however, which heralds the end of capitalist logic, is the occurrence of cycle-independent mass unemployment since the mid-1970s, which has increased almost independently of the economic development and is apparently trending upwards. In the development of capital up to now, such a process has seemed to appear for a short while several times, but at each instance it was caught again by a new spurt of accumulation. By and large, the level of unemployment followed the cycle of capital accumulation, the absorption and repulsion of living labor power in the immediate capitalist process of production. This previously valid law has been suspended in all imperialist core countries for more than a decade. Even serious bourgeois economists see an unstoppable trend that is bound to produce apocalyptic unemployment figures and a hopeless collapse of the social network based on the money economy by the turn of the century. All the talk by bourgeois politicians about a hoped-for upswing and global economic consolidation must be measured against this inexorable logic. The boom of the mid-1980s, confined to a few countries with the most advanced productivity, left mass unemployment almost untouched even in these areas. The fact that it currently seems to be stagnating and is not much higher is more likely to be attributed to statistical tricks and manipulations by the capitalist labor administration, which has to fool the public into believing a rather stylized picture of the situation than to an actual stagnation in the release process of living direct production work. The decisive wave of the microelectronics revolution in production is still to come in many branches of production and also in most unproductive areas. Any upturn that is still conceivable for parts of capital in the future will fundamentally no longer stop the increase in mass unemployment. The presumably unavoidable objection has to be replied to that the theory of the devaluation of value outlined here is wrong, illusory, and possibly utopian, because it presupposes the absolute full automation of the entire production, the empty ghost factory, and so on, as a social average. Such an objection would be naive because it does not take into account the accumulation logic of capital, as determined by the production of relative surplus value, but gets stuck in rigid definitions. The collapse of the value relation does not only begin when the last worker has been eliminated from direct production, rather, it begins precisely at the historical point in which the general relationship between the elimination and reabsorption of living direct productive labor begins to tip over, i.e. starting at the moment and successively progressing to the extent where and how more living direct productive labor is eliminated than being reabsorbed. Presumably this point, as far as one can speak of such, is already in the past today. Around the early to mid-1970s, it is no coincidence that this period marks both the collapse of the Bretton Woods monetary system and the beginning of the technological mass unemployment. Of course, one must not imagine the collapse of the value relationship as a sudden and one-off act, although sudden burglaries and collapses, e.g. bank crashes, mass bankruptcies and so on, will definitely be part of the collapse, but as a historical process, as an entire epoch of perhaps several decades in which the capitalist world economy can no longer get out of the whirlpool of crisis and devaluation processes, rising mass unemployment, and the serious class struggles that will inevitably follow sooner or later. It should be noted in conclusion that this development also decided an old debate about the ability of capitalism to further develop the productive forces. Surprisingly, this question was mostly related to whether capitalism could push the material productive force as such, whether it could continue the process of scientification beyond a certain level in its monopolistic stage. Depending on the answer to this question, the chance of survival of capitalism was assessed. From the conceptual definition developed so far, it is not difficult to see how fundamentally wrong this question itself is, how much it misunderstands authentic Marxism and the objective logic of capital. It is not the limit of the development of productive power that is reached, but the limit of the objectivity of value. Not only can capitalism further develop the material productive forces, it must do so incessantly, according to its own logic of development. The limit of capital is capital itself, Marx, that is, value. Objectively, capital does not fail because of the development of material productive forces as such, but because the compulsion to have to banish these enormous social potentials of science and technology within the limits of value. This is the only way to understand the Marxist statement that capitalism must perish due to the development of the productive forces. 7. Reversal by competition. Why can't capital recognize that it is historically digging its own grave with the production of relative surplus value through the development of productive power? I have already pointed out that the category of relative surplus value and surplus value in general is not a superficial category that could appear in the consciousness of the representatives of valorizing money capital. The reason for this is ultimately to be found in the fact that capital can never really appear as total capital, but always, in whatever form, as competing individual capital. The value category presupposes the category of exchange, and thus private producers that are formally and economically independent of one another in some sense, even highly developed forms of state capitalism in which the state appears not only as an ideal but increasingly as a real total capitalist cannot do away with this basic fact. As long as a value relation exists socially at all, and with it the objectivity of production, which in turn is expressed in the form of money as a general form of exchange, as long as the point of view of the whole is a practical impossibility in reality, the point of view of the totality of social reproduction process can then be taken by the state, by its authorities only formally and externally, but not in terms of content. Just as the state as such is already an expression of the economic separation of social part producers and their non-social character in production. On all levels, therefore, moments of competition must always develop anew and grow back like the heads of the Hydra, also on the level of interaction between states. For individual capital, the overall process presents itself only from its own standpoint as a participant in the struggle for markets, for the capitalist state, and as an ideal and increasingly real in terms of external exchange value, total capitalist, from its standpoint as the representative of a national total capital in the battle for markets and spheres of influence for an imperialistic bloc, again from its point of view as a coalition of different national capitals in the fight against another competing bloc for markets, political and military spheres of influence. In these competitive struggles on all levels of the appearing surface, the process of value production is by no means presented in the same way as in the theoretical concept of total social reproduction, the point of view practically nobody takes. While from the perspective of total reproduction, the opposite, tendentially self-eliminating movement in the production of relative surplus value becomes visible. It disappears without a trace from the point of view of competing individual capital. In total reproduction, the production of relative surplus value appears absurd because with the increase in the rate of surplus value, it simultaneously produces a reduction in the mass of surplus value. However, this applies not only theoretically but also practically exclusively to the overall process, but by no means so that the respective special capital, whose individual increase in the rate of profit, extra profit, through the development of productive power is not paid for in the slightest, with a simultaneous reduction in the mass of profit. The logic of the development of productive power is to produce more products in the same period of time with less human labor. Viewed abstractly, i.e., each individual capital taken by itself, the absurd opposite movement of relative surplus value would also appear on the level of individual capital, i.e. more value is appropriated per worker, while at the same time the absolute mass of new value created decreases because less living productive work has been applied. However, this consideration remains abstract because the individual capital, of course, does not reproduce itself on its own, but in the competitive relationship of many capitals to one another. The production of surplus value and its realization in circulation, i.e., in the exchange processes on the market, diverge. It is therefore necessary to clarify what takes place between production and realization in circulation through the competitive relationship. If a single capital doubles the productive power of its total aggregate, from its point of view, dead labor in the form of machines and living labor are not differentiated but present themselves equally as input cost factors, while at the same time reducing living labor, this is initially a reduction in the input costs, the amortization of the improved machinery already taken into account, while at the same time the output of material products increases, namely doubles. However, because of the reduced amount of living labor, this increased quantity of material products has a lower mass of value and therefore also a smaller mass of value for each individual product. But the reduction in the absolute mass of value only appears in the case of the individual capital with the individually increased productive power. Each individual product of a more productive capital contains less value than the corresponding product in its social average. But only the social average is valid on a market. As far as the monetary expression of the commodity value is concerned, and this alone is of practical interest, it is now twice as high for the more productive individual capital, since it appears on the market with twice as large a quantity of material products, with a still valid social average of these products. Of course, this money expression is initially only the price and not yet the realization through the sale, since a double quantity of goods meets a limited market with limited purchasing power. But of course, the more productive capital now has enormous leeway in comparison to all other market participants to lower the price and thus to sell double the quantity of goods. Because even if this capital now has to sell twice its quantity of products below their currently valid social monetary value in order to conquer the market share necessary for twice the material quantity of products, the relationship between absolute input costs and absolute output as yields has shifted enormously in its favor. Here, the reversal of the real situation of society as a whole through the movement of competition becomes clear. In the total overall reproduction of capital, every reduction in living production work, no matter where it takes place, naturally also leads to a reduction in the total mass of value. But it is precisely the capital that brings about this reduction in living labor that individually appropriates a higher profit. The fact that the actual process for individual capital presents itself in such a wrong way on the market surface is due to the fluidity of the abstract exchange value of money in comparison to the rigidity and bulkiness of the material mass of products. The mass of value, represented in material use values, and the mass of liquid money goods are in a constantly oscillating balance, which is produced through disproportionalities and which takes on extremely complicated forms on the world market level. If the German and Japanese automobile industry develop a higher labor productivity than, for example, the English, this means in itself that in every car produced in Germany and Japan there is a smaller amount of abstract human labor, i.e. a smaller mass of value, if we consider the real social fiction of the objectiveness of things as a basis. Furthermore, this means that in the automobile industry in Japan and Germany a lower value mass is produced in absolute terms than in the English one, at least as long as no additional production capacities are built up. On the market surface, however, this situation presents itself quite differently, precisely because of their higher productivity, their lower use of living labor. The German and Japanese automobile capitalists produce more cheaply than the English, the only criterion of interest to the vulgar abstract bourgeois economic mind, and can therefore also offer cheaper, can throw the English suppliers out of the market and still post an extra profit in their overall balance. In fact, the following has happened in spite of actually having less added value in the process of realizing surplus value. The German and Japanese automobile capitalists have been able to attract a greater mass of the liquid money commodity on the market than the English, i.e. on the world market they have actually appropriated through redistribution a part of what is surplus value produced in England. On the surface, the reversal of the real movement appears in the form that capital which, through higher productivity and the elimination of direct living production labor, reduces the absolute total capitalist mass of value, which as such does not concern any particular capital, i.e. sawing away on the branch they are sitting on and being rewarded for it by extra profit and larger market shares, while conversely, that capital which applies more living production labor per commodity and thereby maintains the total mass of value and the value as value is punished for this by losing market shares and the non-realization of the surplus value it produces. In the totality of this redistribution process, the inexorable law of value is taken into account by the fact that the English automobile industry gets stuck with some of its products, so that these products only represent material use values but can no longer be considered exchange values. It is clear what happens to these depreciated utility values. They are of course not given to the poor, but first stored, then depending on their material composition either completely destroyed or processed back into raw materials or semi-finished products. Crushed, melted, burned, dumped into the sea and so on, in any case destroyed as use values, because they obtained no mercy from the king of commodities, the money commodity. All over the world, use values of all kinds are being wantonly destroyed daily and hourly on an ever-increasing scale. Humanity, in ever more frenzied madness, sacrifices hecatombs of objectified torment to the dark, uncomprehended god of its own society, the law of exchange value. The ancient families of the gods would have to turn green with envy. This madness is only possible through the divergence of production and circulation, through the liquidity of money and the constant redistribution of surplus value on the world market mediated by competition. It is this reversal caused by competition that blocks capital's view of the fatal consequences this process has on its own mode of production on the level of reproduction in society as a whole. Only then does it become clear what Marx writes about capital as the process of its subjective self-abolition, Selbstaufhebung. To the same extent as labor time, the mere quantity of labor, is posited by capital as the sole determining element, to the same extent also direct labor and its quantity as the determining principle of production, the creation of use values, disappears and decreases both quantitatively reduced in a small proportion as well as qualitatively as an indispensable but subordinate moment against general scientific work, technological application of the natural sciences on the one hand, as against the general productive power resulting from the social organization in the total production, that as a natural gift of social work, although historical product, appears. Capital is thus working on its own dissolution as the form that dominates production. The logic of capital's self-abolition remained obscured for a historical short period of just under 100 years, as long as capital's expansion process still found a terrain for the capitalization of non-capitalist branches of production and for the creation of new labor-intensive industries. If this process of expansion today begins to come up against absolute limits, the reversal caused by competition will of course not be abolished, but on the contrary, competition will be intensified and the process of scientification, with all its consequences for society as a whole, will be accelerated even more. Since the beginning of the 1970s, i.e. again, since that as yet uncomprehended phase of the tipping over of the historical logic of capital, the tendency has been foreseeable that the scope of the world market is beginning to shrink inexorably, that a new, and I assert on the basis of the preceding derivation, final phase of the battle for markets has begun, which can be mastered neither with economic nor political or military means. On the periphery of capitalist industrial societies, in countries like Spain, Portugal, Greece and so on, sometimes even in imperial core countries like France, Italy and Great Britain, the merciless redistribution process of the surplus value, which is shrinking in mass worldwide due to the new material level of socialization, has already plunged entire branches of industry into agony. Germany is no longer unaffected by this either, steel and shipyard crisis and so on. The leaders and the Krisengewinnler, petty winners during the crisis, in this redistribution process, which is becoming ever narrower, mainly Japan, the FRG and to a lesser extent also the USA, are trying to besiege the upswing and to deny the job-killing consequences of the new socializing technologies. In fact, the inversion caused by competition makes it appear on the surface that the victors of the competition-mediated realization and redistribution process of world surplus value are not only maintaining their positions but are even temporarily expanding their production capacities in order to create new jobs and be able to increase the absolute mass of added value generated in their country again. This expansion, which is quite real for the countries and individual capitalists concerned, is only a sham expansion of the overall reproduction process of world capital. It is not based on an expansion process of capital as a whole, whose historical limits have been reached, but is based exclusively on the destruction of other capitals. The additional jobs are not created by microelectronics, but by the destruction of jobs, capital and goods in other countries and competing other capitals. The situation that one capital can only grow at the expense of other capitals and is no longer limited to the periodic crisis in past periods of capitalist development through expansion into historically free territory is now becoming a permanent and irreversible normal state. In the last epoch of capital relations, the reversal caused by competition necessarily led into a spiral of ever more intensified trade wars. The preliminary victories of the FRG and Japan in the world market theater of war must sooner or later prove to be Pyrrhic victories, to the same extent as the world market was protected by the political Iron Curtain of protectionism, which, despite all purely ideological protestations to the contrary, also constantly expanded since those ominous early 1970s, is eventually collapsing and thus strangles the export economy, the actual driving force behind the economic development of Japan and the Federal Republic of Germany. Since the character masks of capital, including a value and wage fetishist trade union movement as the mask of variable capital, are only oriented towards the surface of the phenomena and can only move within the reversals of the actual process through world market competition, everyone only sees a single solution and blows into the same horn. Even more rationalization, even more scientification, that be left behind in the technological race. And they are right, except that with every small advantage that is won on the world market, ironically, they dig the grave a little deeper for the overall system of the exploitation of value. For this world outside of which they cannot think of any other, nor do they want to. In the last decades of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century, the peoples, as character masks of the self-exploitation of value, will offer the picture of a mad pack of wolves tearing themselves apart for the sake of even smaller chunks of value. All political and possibly military conflicts in this epoch will increasingly no longer be mere side effects of the capitalist accumulation process, but direct expressions of the historical end of this accumulation, i.e. the burning out of the capitalist logic as such. The relationship between the economy and politics thus acquires a new quality. 8. Crisis and crisis theories. In conclusion, I would now like to briefly discuss the question of why Marxist theory has so far not worked out the real dimension of capitalist logic in its crisis, which is at least implicitly contained in Marx's work. In this context, the historical approaches of Marxist crisis theory are of interest. As is well known, Marx did not leave behind a complete theory of crisis corresponding to the overall fragmentary character of his enormous body of work. The third volume of Capital and the Theories of Surplus Value, which contain essential statements on the theories of crisis, consist entirely of such fragments that have not been finally worked out. Historically, this editorial starting point alone has led to the fact that in the Marxist debate, individual aspects of the crisis theory left behind by Marx, which was not fully systematized, became independent of one another. The oldest layer of interpretation of Marxist crisis theory in the Second International presents itself as a pure theory of overproduction or underconsumption, Engels, Kautsky, Luxemburg. From this theory of overproduction, the crisis as such actually resulted very simply from the contradiction between the development of the productive power of labor on the one hand and the lack of purchasing power of the masses who were limited to the value of the commodity labor power and their reproduction on the other. However, the weakness of this initially evident interpretation is twofold. On the one hand, it derives the crisis as a pure circulation phenomenon and not from the production of surplus value itself, which is where the illusions of political influence on the capitalist reproduction process come from to this day, increasing the purchasing power of the masses as a supposed remedy. Secondly, however, it basically starts from a simple reproduction of the total capital and not from the historical fact of the expansion of capital as a production relation mediated by the production of relative surplus value. With a simple reproduction, the evidence of the contradiction between limited mass consumption and the development of productive power would come to light immediately. Admittedly, this manifest contradiction would also be a derived surface phenomenon, which itself would first have to be traced back to the underlying tendency to abolish value in direct production. However, through the actual expansion and constantly expanded reproduction of capital as a historical compensation mechanism, access to the real logic of the development of capital was initially completely buried and thus remained hidden and inaccessible to the theorists who were fixated on circulation in terms of crisis theory. Only Rosa Luxemburg attempted to incorporate a systematic historical element into the theory of crisis and to present it as a developmental logic of capital with absolute limits. Unfortunately, however, in accordance with the approach, which is limited to circulation, exactly the wrong way round, as the alleged alimony of the capitalist realization of surplus value by non- and pre-capitalist producers or consumers, instead of as compensatory expansion of the mass of surplus value by sucking in living production labor on a constantly expanding scale. In the Second International, there was indeed a widespread notion of the possibly imminent collapse of capitalism, but rather as a vague idea without an adequate conceptual derivation, and certainly not from the splitting of the concept of productive work and the abolition of the objectivity of value as such. With the exception of the wrong form in Rosa Luxemburg, the collapse idea has hardly been explicitly formulated as a theory at all. It thus became an easy prey for Bernsteinian revisionism, which could flatly refer to the superficial development of a higher stage of capital expansion that was emerging around the turn of the century. The orthodox insistence of Kautskyism, on the other hand, remained woodenly dogmatic and defensive, especially on the collapse question. While Bernstein accused Marx of having a collapse theory without being able to put it into concrete terms and referred to the opposing empiricism of expanding capital, Kautsky countered lamely with the assertion that such a collapse theory did not exist. Both Bernstein and Kautsky ultimately saw the overthrow of capitalism in the social political action of the proletariat alone, not in an underlying objective collapse of the conditions themselves. Their position actually differed only in nuances. The idea of collapse appeared in the ascending imperialist expansion of capital as a kind of naive belief, like the early Christian belief in the imminent return of the Messiah, including the end of the world and the Last Judgment. Its few theoretical and political representatives, such as Rosa Luxemburg, were marginalized. Since then, one can speak of a reformist subjectivism, which was later supplemented by a revolutionary subjectivism of the Western Marxists, and partly in the wake of the Frankfurt School. For easily understandable reasons, Russian Bolshevism was unable to bring about a change in this question. Although Lenin defended objectivity as such philosophically and politically against reformist and radical left revoltist subjectivism, he was at least as far removed from an objective theory of crisis and collapse as the Western social democrats and revolutionaries. Crisis theory is hardly touched upon in his imperialist pamphlet, and this is by no means accidental. Because of course Russia, which was not even capitalistically developed, was a long way from burning out the logic of capitalist accumulation, much further than Western capitalism, a fact that may have remained valid to this day. Lenin found no social basis at all for a conceptual derivation and further development of the Marxist theory of crisis of all things. As I have pointed out above, neither in the East nor in the West were the revolutions and revolutionary movements at the end of the First World War based on any fundamental economic crisis, but rather on an upheaval of conditions primarily caused by the war itself, by the relatively independent political clashes of a historically still expanding capital. Theoretically, Lenin could and had to be primarily concerned with a certain stage that had actually been reached, precisely analyzing and presenting as an objective basis the imperialist, highly concentrated capital mixed with state capitalist elements, not of a collapse of historical accumulation as such and in general, but of the political clash of the national imperialist capitals and the consequent possible conscious political action of the working class, which could bring the process of capitalist development to a standstill worldwide. Only in this respect was he allowed to speak of imperialism as the last and highest stage of capitalism. And to that extent, the Bolshevik Revolution, what was specifically socialist about it, was primarily political, both in terms of the small capitalist development of Russian society directly and on a larger scale, in terms of the global international situation of the unfolding of capitalist logic as a whole. However, it is evident that no adequate theory of crisis could be developed on this theoretical basis of Leninism. This shortcoming was immediately avenged by the fact that Lenin was fundamentally mistaken in the maturity of the Western Revolution, Of course, it would be downright shabby to accuse him of this error in hindsight, which, given the foundations he had, is difficult to avoid. As a revolutionary, he rightly had to exhaust all theoretical possibilities for the actually given revolutionary situation. The main focus of the Marxist debate and polemics thus shifted to politics, whose relative independence was increasingly overused to the point of dogmatic reification of the political sphere and a complete conceptual divergence between economics and politics. The world economic crisis at the beginning of the 1930s therefore found the Marxist crisis theory weaker than ever and with rusty and jagged weapons. Henrik Grossmann, who took up the debate about Rosa Luxemburg's collapse theory again and sought to critically substantiate it anew, remained, like Paul Matic, who followed him, rather lonely and without any real mediation to the main theoretical currents. In their critique of Rosa Luxemburg, Grossmann and Matic correctly went back from circulation to the production of surplus value itself and defined the essence of the crisis as overaccumulation of capital, which can appear as overproduction in the sphere of circulation, but is not essentially determined by it. This progress in the theory of crisis was surely paid for in that, together with the fruitful approach to a historically absolute finite logic of the development of capital, the wrong fixation on circulation in Rosa Luxemburg's theory was also adopted. The reason for this is to be found in the fact that Grossmann and Matic certainly went back to production, but not to the contradiction between the development of material productive power and its objective nature. In this respect, like all previous crisis theories, they remained value immanent and ultimately unable to identify the contradiction in the concept of productive work itself. Grossmann's attempt to nevertheless stick to the collapse theory was thus limited to a highly questionable value immanent arithmetic example, which, like the earlier crisis debate, does not have its starting point in the conceptual derivation of value in productive work, but in the reproduction schemes of the second volume of Capital, and thus remains attached to the market mediations of the surface from the outset. In the end, therefore, Paul Matic no longer explicitly adhered to a concretely derivable theory of collapse, as did Grossmann. It is thus evident that all previous Marxist crisis theories have in fact not progressed beyond the value immanent approach, and have not taken up the elements of a logical historical explosion of the value relationship contained in Marx's work as such. The question of crisis, both in theories related to the realization and in the theories related to the production of surplus value, is dealt with only within the horizon of quantitative value relations and their analysis. The disproportionality is only grasped within the quantitative logic of value and not as a qualitative one in relation of substance and value. In other words, it is not the value relationship as such that is becoming obsolete as a result of the crisis, only the blind regulatory mechanism via the market. It is not the value relation as such that collapses, but merely the relative equilibrium of exchange value. Theoretically, only the abridged understanding of the law of value, outlined at the outset, reappears here in the crisis debate. Of course, it would be wrong to raise only an abstract, because unhistorical reproach here. For this theoretical reduction is only on the basis of Marxism an ideal expression of an epoch in which the capital relation also in reality only survives the crisis within the limits of the value relation, and the threshold has not yet been reached beyond which the value relation as such in the development of the productive forces begins to break down and collapses. This level is only being reached today, 1985, with the new socializing technologies in which applied natural science and work science flow together, and thus only allow the industrial system to emerge from its rough embryonic forms. This way, the unsuccessful definition of post-industrialism completely misjudges the real development. Historically, capitalism can be deciphered today as identical with the crude, awkward, immature, and in every respect dirty precursor to the really immediately social industry, which only today grows out of the capitalist germ and thus irrevocably bursts it. The socialist and communist left, however, is even less prepared than it was at the beginning of the 1930s for the coming and in some cases already manifest crisis in capital relations. The new epoch of accumulation and prosperity after the Second World War has completely sapped its logical power, just as it left the old practical political workers' movement mutilated and emasculated. The thought of a collapse theory only evokes a know-it-all dismissal, even from alleged radicals, although the problem was never clarified conceptually and theoretically, but merely sank into the swamp of superficial empiricism. Likewise, the question of the determination of a social reproduction that is no longer based on value and is therefore moneyless in the work of Marx and Engels, at best only triggers an embarrassed smile on the left. Both the Marxist theorists oriented towards the Western and the Eastern strand of the old labor movement have long since repressed, forgotten and buried the fundamental critique of value relations. Value as such is unconsciously accepted as a second natural relation. All socialist program, strategy and practice does not refer to the abolition of the value relationship, and thus wage labor, but solely to the form of the social allocation mechanism through the law of value. What emerges is the absolute flat opposition of plan and market, whereby the concept of social planning remains subject to the value fetish. The logically absent abolition of the abstract individual of commodity production, as the real police socialism of the East demonstrates with particular repulsion, must then be transferred back to the subject without any concept. It is no coincidence that the alienation debate of the New Left culminates in neo-religiousness and spiritualism, but the radical spring of the subjective political left since 1968 has passed without a hitch. All theories and proposals of the left in a broader sense, which refer to the new social phenomena, regardless of whether they are orthodox Marxist or left-wing socialist or green alternative, Kurz and so on, have only one thing in common, namely that they deal with the question of the objective and subjective abolition of the value relationship. But the new crisis of capital, which involves value-abolishing development of productive power, cannot be solved or even stopped, either by external police state intervention, Keynesianism, state capitalism, or by naive social political tinkering, as in the dual economy models, Kurz, Huber and so on. By no means do I want to fundamentally diminish the role of the subject. All real upheaval must pass through the social class subject and its political mediations. A fortiori, it would be a great misunderstanding to conclude some mechanical automatism of the transformation to socialism from the concrete derivation of an objective and historically actual logic of the collapse of capital. Rather, the opposite is the case. The Marxian alternative, which includes the transition to barbarism as a possibility, is only really topical and understandable for the first time today. A breakdown is nothing other than a breakdown. The real conditions that develop from this always and continue to depend on the actual actions of people and their will. But this will could not and cannot go beyond the objective conditions, which it must have understood in their objectivity in order to become consciously effective. However, a fundamental historical change has taken place here, which has its grounds in the actual maturity of the capital relationship. For the old workers' movement too, which had its historical culmination and opportunity at the end of the First World War, the objectivity of capital and its development was the basis and prerequisite for political will, but in a more general sense than today. The logic of capital had not yet burned itself out, but it could only be stopped and overcome by social action carried out with a high awareness of this logic. The possibility of doing so certainly existed, but the Western workers' movement, which alone could have come into question for this act, did not raise this level of consciousness. But the story didn't stop there. Even the logic that is not understood remains objective, real, and can be experienced, eventually suffered until consciousness and the will bring themselves to it because there is no other way. To the extent that the capitalist logic burns out and perishes today, this compulsion also begins to appear. Since the prophet did not come to the mountain starts to move and comes terribly to the prophet, to whom running away is no help either. It must therefore be admitted that it makes quite a difference whether proletarian action consciously brings about the end of capitalist accumulation, which in itself has not yet been exhausted, or whether conversely, consciousness and action of the working class are brought about and enforced by the objectively manifested historical end of the possibility of accumulation, independently of the will of those involved. In the first case, the organized class consciously exploits temporary disproportionality and political military frictions in the existing order in order to overthrow it. These opportunities have historically passed by unused, no way leads back to the situation. In the second case, that is, the historically current one, still largely lying ahead of us, this order collapses in itself due to its own contradictions, which have been pushed to the end without simultaneously producing a new social formation. Neither the role of the subject nor that of the relative autonomy of the political form of the contradiction is thereby abolished. But the starting point has become a different one. The much quoted hic Rhodos, hic salta, proverb often used by Marx, there is Rhodos, there you have to dance, is irrevocably becoming reality for the left, but in a different way than they thought. The text first appeared in Marxist Criticism No. 1, March 1986, the forerunner of the theoretical journal Krisis. It was translated using Google Translate, redacted and read aloud by me at Grubenich.